It began with a night of terror. Sometimes the most peaceful places hide the darkest secrets. Lakewood, Connecticut, a quintessential New England town nestled among thick pine forests and serene lakes, had always seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world. With a population of just over 3,000, life in Lakewood moved at a gentle, predictable pace. Locals took comfort in their routines and trusted that nothing truly terrible would ever disturb the calm. But it was on the night of August 4, 1985 that this illusion was violently shattered. The sky was inky black, moonless, and the air hung heavy and still. Most residents were sound asleep, their windows cracked open to catch the faint breeze that offered relief from the muggy summer heat. It was the kind of night when you'd expect nothing more dramatic than the distant hum of crickets and maybe, if you were lucky, the call of a loon drifting in from the lake. At exactly 1:03 a.m. everything changed. A shrill, unnatural alarm split the silence, a siren blaring from the firehouse downtown. Within minutes, lights snapped on across the town, neighbors peeking anxiously out their windows and sleepy-eyed parents pulling on robes, wondering what could possibly warrant such a disruption. Many feared for their own homes, thinking of the old wooden porches and the risk a lightning storm might pose, but this was no random act of nature. Down Main Street, flickering orange and yellow lit up the sky, an inferno devouring the historic Lakewood Town Hall. The building had stood at the heart of the community for more than 2 centuries, a proud monument of brick and white columns, sheltering the town's precious archives, antique furniture, and priceless artifacts. It was, for people here, more than a municipal hub. It was a living memory of Lakewood's beginnings, a symbol of its resilience. Flames shot through the shattered windows and licked the rooftop like hellfire, while startled onlookers gathered at a safe distance, clutching each other in disbelief. Firefighters from Lakewood's small volunteer squadron rushed to the scene, hearts pounding. The old building, full of dry timbers and fragile antiques, burned fast and hot. Men and women struggled desperately with hoses, shouting to one another above the roar. Water arched, steam hissed, but the fire's hunger was relentless. By the time the worst was over and daylight began to break, it was clear that something precious had been lost forever. Charred timbers collapsed into blackened piles, and papers, some dating back to the American Revolution, fluttered as ashes in the early morning light. People wept openly in the middle of Main Street. There was a sense of shared violation, of history torn away in a single night. As the smoke began to clear, however, unease crept in. The fire, some whispered, had moved too quickly, too precisely, and the jagged edge of a window pane spoke to something more deliberate, a brick or hammer, not a careless spark. Rumors hissed through the crowd. Had someone truly meant to destroy Lakewood's beating heart? Within hours, a yellow tape circled the ruins, and the sleepy town was wide awake in fear. Even the oldest residents, who'd seen every manner of accident or argument, confessed they'd never felt such dread. Suspicion hung thick in the air, and the word arson was whispered with new, raw anxiety. What, if anything, had led to this night of terror? Who would want to erase the soul of Lakewood? This story, which would come to define the town's collective memory, was only just unfolding. In the ashes, the first glimmers of suspicion. When the morning sun finally pierced the smoky haze settling over Lakewood, few were prepared for what daylight revealed. The town hall was unrecognizable, reduced to a skeletal framework of charred brick and sagging beams. Ash coated every surface, drifting onto streets, sticking to the shoes of first responders, and settling like gray snowfall on those who wandered the site in a daze. Where elegant windows once cast sunlight into the marble-floored atrium, only jagged shards and blackened sills remained. Columns that had stood for generations now leaned at dangerous angles or had collapsed entirely, mixing with piles of debris in the open shell of the entryway. The most painful losses, though, couldn't be measured in bricks or mortar. Fragile ledgers, birth records, and hand-inked property deeds, some of them dating before the Revolution, were charred beyond recognition or fluttered away in the wind as sooty confetti. Entire generations seemed to vanish in an instant, snuffed out by a single nightmarish blaze. Residents wandered the edges of the caution tape, weeping softly, consoling each other beneath a sun that offered little warmth. Yet as the shock slowly ebbed, tension began to mutter beneath the grief. The aftermath attracted more than firefighters and news crews. The police moved in to secure the area, determined to uncover what had really happened. And it didn't take long before they spotted signs that something wasn't right. Detectives studied the patterns of the burn, unconvinced by theories of an electrical fault. It was the window on the north side, its heavy glass shattered outward rather than inward, its sill blackened but framed by a suspiciously neat circle among the scorched earth, that drew the most attention. Investigators marked the location and began combing through the debris nearby. Soot-stained officers retrieved mysterious metallic fragments, then flagged an unmistakable scent lingering near the window ledge, a sharp chemical tang out of place in the remnants of old pine and paperwork. Hushed exchanges between officers grew more urgent, the words accelerant and forced entry whispered among them. Was this building truly lost to random fate, or was it the work of a calculated hand? By late afternoon, somber police tapes circled the ruins, signaling that the investigation was moving in a more troubling direction. Lakewood was no longer mourning a fire, it was bracing itself for the possibility of arson, a violation that cut deeper than flames ever could. For many, the destruction of Town Hall was turning from an inexplicable tragedy to the opening move in a much darker game. The questions in every conversation were the same. Who would do such a thing? Why now? And as authorities began the meticulous work of sifting through ashes, the community understood that its long-cherished sense of safety was gone. The search for answers, and for justice, had just begun. Launching the investigation, no sooner had the ashes at Lakewood settled, than the small-town routines fractured under the weight of collective dread. Over coffee in kitchen nooks and whispered exchanges across picket fences, residents speculated who could dare lay waste to the heart of their community. The local police force, already stretched thin by the scope of such devastation, found themselves at a crossroads. None among them had ever handled a case so high-profile, nor so deeply personal. At the police station, Chief Brad Myers pored over fire reports and statements from shaken townspeople. The typically subdued hum in the building was replaced by tension thick enough to draw a knife through. Determined not to let panic take root, Chief Myers set up an emergency task force. Each officer had a role: canvassing neighborhoods, cataloging lost artifacts, knocking on doors under the glare of early morning news vans. What they uncovered, though, amounted to precious little. The only tangible clue, the broken window on the north face of Town Hall, hinted conspiracy, not accident. With pressure mounting from the community and media, Chief Myers sought outside expertise. He contacted Dr. Emma Lee, a renowned forensic analyst affiliated with the Connecticut State Crime Lab. Dr. Lee was known for her exacting standards and her uncanny ability to drag truth from stubborn evidence. Her arrival in Lakewood set the townsfolk abuzz, some hopeful, others wary. "If anyone can see what we can't, it's her," murmured one elderly resident. Dr. Lee's first order of business was to secure the scene. She supervised the collection of every potentially telling sample, from sooty fragments of wood to glass shards, from melts of metal fixtures to strange, acrid-smelling debris pooled beneath window frames. Every bag was labeled, every detail photographed. Even the positioning of the most mundane items, burned file cabinets, blackened drawer handles, was entered into her meticulous notebook. Questions grew with each piece of evidence. Was this a random act of malice or something targeted? Had someone set the blaze to destroy particular records or to erase history itself? Nick Hansen, the station's youngest deputy, voiced what many feared. This wasn't just about fire, someone wanted us to be afraid. Bloodshot but focused, investigators worked around the clock. Dr. Lee set up a makeshift lab in an unused office at the station, where she began preliminary chemical tests on the debris. Meanwhile, the community's veneer of security had cracked wide open. Lakewood's small population grew even more tightly knit, but trust had become a rare commodity. The investigation was underway, but the path forward was anything but clear. The people of Lakewood eyed one another with suspicion, and for the first time in decades, they realized just how fragile their peace truly was. Breakthrough Discovery by the Doctor. Dr. Emma Lee's breakthrough began early on a gray, rain-soaked morning, as she stood amid the ashen ruins of Lakewood's beloved town hall. The air was heavy with the odor of charred wood and ancient records reduced to blackened scraps. Outwardly calm, Dr. Lee's mind was racing, chasing down every clue the destruction had hidden in plain sight. Her team worked methodically under her direction, collecting samples of everything from melted frame fragments to clumps of burned insulation and brittle dark flakes that once might have been paper. While townsfolk watched, whispering and wary, Dr. Lee ran her gloved fingers along the stone window ledge on the north side, the suspicious point of entry. She bagged tiny glass shards and scraped away a curious dark residue clinging to the sill. It smelled tangy, chemical, out of place amid the smoky chaos. Back in her makeshift forensic lab, nestled into a borrowed municipal office, Dr. Lee set to work. Using headspace gas chromatography, she meticulously analyzed the compounds collected from the window ledge and other debris. As results spat onto the printer's page, her suspicions tightened. There it was, clear traces of a fire accelerant, specifically vaporized gasoline mixed with other volatile organic chemicals. She checked again, isolating each marker, and her expert certainty deepened. This blaze was no accident of faulty wiring or lightning. It was deliberate, planned, executed with chilling intent. She called Chief Myers and the investigative team. Someone set this fire, intentionally. We're searching for an arsonist, not a mere mistake. This chemical proof altered the entire course of the investigation. The townspeople's pain mutated into unease, and their unease into fear. There was a predator among them, capable of destroying not just property, but their shared past. Dr. Lee's findings were recorded, sealed, and handed off to forensic investigators for court evidence. The hunt for answers gained a new urgency, propelling every officer and neighbor into active suspicion. That afternoon, as storm clouds rolled back and sunlit motes danced over the police tape, Dr. Lee returned once more to the blackened bones of Town Hall. She stood quietly for a moment, feeling the collective tension coiling tighter. With a grim sense of purpose, she pressed on. Her breakthrough did more than change the investigation. It forced a town to confront the dark possibilities lurking beneath its surface. Family turbulence and community shockwaves. The aftermath of the shocking murder in Silverfield sent ripples of grief and fear that forever altered the fabric of both the Wilson family and the wider community. For the Wilsons, the loss of Gloria, so sudden, savage, and inexplicable, was a wound that would never quite close. Her mother, once the cornerstone of every family gathering and holiday tradition, became withdrawn, speaking little and moving as if ever carried by the weight of sorrow. Jimmy, the youngest brother, struggled daily with survivor's guilt, replaying imagined scenarios where he could have protected his sister. His laughter, so common in the kitchen or out on the ball fields, was replaced by long silences and eventually the dark spiral of depression. Unable to sleep or focus at work, Jimmy ultimately relocated to another state, trying to outrun both the whispers of tragedy and his own fractured reflection. Gloria's boyfriend, who had been planning their future and sharing dreams of a house, road trips, and perhaps children, could not cope with the sudden abyss where hope had been. Plagued by nightmares and the stares of neighbors for whom no one could find reassuring words, he too left town, vanishing amidst the suburban anonymity of some faraway city. Neighbors who once treated each other as extended kin became furtive and cautious. The regular clatter of backyard barbecues and Sunday church potlucks dulled to a hush. People who previously left pies on each other's porches now pulled their children closer, eyes searching for threats. Laundry lines, once strung with bright summer shirts, now flapped empty in the wind. The old men who played checkers outside the hardware store stopped lingering in the red dusk, their easy talk of sports and weather replaced by grim speculation and shared haunted looks. In Main Street diners and the lunchrooms of the abandoned factories, conversation always circled back to the murder and what could have been done differently. Parents argued over curfews and teenagers whispered lurid theories to scare each other. The school board rushed to create self-defense programs, and the town council approved overtime for the night patrols. Store shelves emptied of locks, baseball bats, and flashlight batteries every time a new rumor hit. There was mourning in the creatures of habit as well. The librarian who started double-bolting the front doors, the pastor who left porch lights glowing until dawn, and the postmaster who asked for ID at the window for the first time since anyone could remember. Silverfield's sense of security fractured. For years, any sound in the night or sudden knock on the door sent fresh chills rippling through a town that used to believe dark things happened elsewhere. And yet, beneath the fear, a stubborn thread of togetherness pressed on. Those who stayed behind sought solace in unity, candlelight vigils, casseroles delivered to grieving houses, and a silent recognition in each neighbor's gaze that the lives they shared had changed, maybe forever. Mason and the unexpected confession. Mason Brooks had never been the sort of man who thrived under the weight of pressure. A lifelong resident of Lakewood, he had always kept to the edges, skittish, quick to avoid confrontation, the sort of person who knew everyone's name but rarely said more than a few words at a time. The days following the fire found him more jittery than usual. He lingered in the shadows of town, casting furtive glances at every passing patrol car. In a town turned suspicious, Mason seemed to shrink even more, haunted by something invisible and heavy. It was in this fragile state that the police brought him in for questioning, having connected the dots between his nervous presence at the bar with Ray Donaldson and the increasingly persistent whispers swirling among the locals. At first, Mason denied everything. He sat hunched at the edge of the interrogation chair, pale fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. His voice quivered, barely more than a whisper, and every glance toward the two-way glass was thick with terror. "I don't know anything. I wasn't even there," he insisted, but the words were unconvincing even to himself. Detective Williams and Chief Myers worked impatiently, allowing silence to hang in the stale air after each question. They offered him a styrofoam cup of weak coffee, slid a notepad across the table, even tried to break his tension with gentle jokes about his mother's famous pumpkin bread. Nothing worked. Mason sat frozen, sweat beating at his hairline, and the seconds dragged on. The investigators could sense the tipping point. For a man so obviously burdened, sometimes the silence itself was damning. Finally, Williams leaned in and said almost quietly, "We know about the fire being set deliberately. We have proof, Mason. If you saw something and keep it to yourself, you could be in real trouble, but if you tell us the truth, we can help you." The words hung there, mingling with the threat of prosecution and the possibility of a lighter sentence. Mason stared at his hands, the clock ticking in the background, his breathing ragged. After what felt like several eternities, Mason's resistance cracked. With his voice barely audible, he choked out, "I don't want to die." Before the officers could press further, Mason revealed the bizarre demand that would become the talk of the police station. He pleaded that they make it look like he'd been roughed up in custody, bruised and battered, so it would seem he hadn't cooperated of his own free will. "You don't know what Ray can do, what Richard can do," he stammered. "If they find out I talked, that's it for me." The officers exchanged tense glances. Coercion or manipulation by suspects wasn't unheard of in Lakewood, but Mason's level of fear was palpable, his paranoia unnerving. Detective Williams reassured him, promising protection, but Mason blanched at every mention of witness protection, certain it wouldn't be enough in a town as small and interconnected as Lakewood. Whether out of desperation or genuine guilt, Mason finally broke. He confessed in shaking broken words to being present during the fateful night. Through stutters and tears, he described how he'd followed Ray out of the bar, worried about what his friend might do, and arrived at the edge of town hall just in time to see Ray smashing the window and pouring something from a canister. Mason claimed he begged Ray to stop, but Ray was beyond reason, wild-eyed, muttering angrily about the damned town that had wronged him. The flames rose up in the window before Mason could utter another word, sending him stumbling back into the shadows, too terrified to intervene or call for help. As Mason spoke, two feelings warred within him, relief at finally unburdening the knowledge, and a wave of guilt so profound it threatened to choke him. He shook violently, haunted by images of the burning building and the knowledge he could have tried harder to prevent the disaster. "I should have done something," he kept repeating, as if the words might absolve him. He described Ray's return a few minutes later, sweating, face illuminated by the distant fire. "It's done," Ray whispered to Mason, before disappearing into the darkness, leaving his friend alone and terrified. The confession provided police with exactly what they needed, a direct eyewitness account that placed Ray Donaldson at the scene, committing the arson. The level of detail in Mason's account, his description of Ray's jacket, the glint of the lighter in his hand, and the smell of gasoline permeating the night air, lined up precisely with physical evidence collected by Dr. Lee. Yet for all its value, Mason's testimony came with the enormous complication of his demand for safety and secrecy. He was convinced, to his core, that talking would make him a target. The investigative team faced a difficult choice. They could grant Mason's request, risking criticism about police conduct and possibly jeopardizing the prosecution's case, or refuse and risk losing the only witness willing to speak up. In the end, they staged a minor scene, a burst of noise in the hallway, a clatter of metal, a fresh bandage on Mason's arm as he was seen leaving. The charade was enough to convince anyone watching, especially from the Donaldson family, that Mason's story, if it came out, would look forced. Over the following days, Mason lived in a haze of anxiety. He was moved from safe house to safe house, never spending more than a night in one place. He jumped at shadows, startled at every knock, and rarely slept. For his own part, the guilt made it difficult to eat or speak. He insisted on preparing a full written statement, going over every detail again and again, in hopes that if anything happened to him, the truth would survive. Despite these efforts, the threat Mason so deeply feared loomed ever closer. There were rumors of Donaldson family members asking questions at the bar, side-eyeing Mason's friends and neighbors, even driving by his temporary residences at odd hours. The sense of impending doom was inescapable, settling over Mason like a shroud. During one particularly sleepless night in a borrowed attic room on the edge of town, Mason wrote out a letter to be left with the police, both a confession and a plea. In wobbling handwriting, he detailed what he'd seen, reaffirmed that Ray was the one who set the blaze, and begged for mercy should anything happen to him. "I did what I could," he wrote. "I wish I'd had the courage to stop him." This letter, together with Mason's anticipated court testimony, formed the linchpin of the prosecution's case. The Lakewood police, now fully aware of the danger Mason was in, redoubled their efforts to keep him safe. He was to appear in court soon to deliver his testimony under heavy guard, a day that many in town hoped would at last bring justice for the devastation of Town Hall. Yet, as the days counted down, the tension in Lakewood rose, a collective breath held tight in fear that the truth, so fragile and costly, could still be lost before it ever had a chance to be spoken aloud. Continuing tragedy. Witness suddenly murdered. Mason Brooks's sudden death hit Lakewood harder than the fire that preceded it. The anticipation of justice, of closure, a chance for the town to start healing, was shattered the morning officials found Mason's body at the fog-draped edge of Willow Lake. He lay crumpled in damp reeds, a fatal gunshot wound to his head, a smattering of dried blood painting the trampled grass. On his person, investigators would later find the wrinkled remnants of his drafted confession, a last relic of the courage he tried to muster in those final days. Panic rippled through every street and alley almost instantly. When news broke, neighbors rushed to lock their doors, kids were pulled off front lawns, rumors pulsed through diners and grocery lines, growing wilder with every retelling. Had Ray Donaldson, desperate and cornered, gone further than arson? Was it someone else seeking, above all, to silence the only person brave, or scared, enough to talk? Theories about the Donaldsons' connections to troublemakers outside of town resurfaced, stoking fresh waves of fear. For law enforcement, Mason's murder marked a catastrophic turn. The death of their key witness didn't just threaten the case against Ray, it sent an unmistakable message to the whole town. Chief Myers convened an emergency meeting in the cramped conference room of the station, his voice hoarse as he reassured his rattled officers. "They want us to be afraid, they want us to back down, we won't!" Yet, beneath the rallying words, the police force was shaken to its core. They were now dealing with a killer whose violence was calculated and whose reach evidently extended beyond a single night of fire. The crime scene at Willow Lake was cordoned off with fierce urgency. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the early morning fog as forensic techs swept the area. Dr. Emma Lee, summoned before sunrise, methodically catalogued every trace of the killer's passage, churned earth where Mason had struggled, hints of tire tread in moist mud, footprints, several distinct tread patterns pressed into the bank. Pieces of evidence, big and small, found their way into carefully labeled bags, a bent cigarette, a gum wrapper, a broken watch clasp. The lakeside, usually a refuge for local fishermen, was now a chilling tableau of unfinished business. As news of Mason's fate spread, the town's mood soured into a brittle, paranoid silence. The routine that once defined Lakewood, the wave from the mailman, the neighbor's greeting at the post office, was replaced by exchanged glances, suspicious and weary. No one felt safe. Even those not involved in the investigation harbored the bone-deep knowledge that secrets could invite violence. Strangers received long stares. Old friendships began to fray. Mason's death became a lightning rod for anger and grief. At his memorial, hastily organized at the church on the hill, attendees filled the pews, heads bowed. Some wept quietly, many more seethed. Reverend Morgan, his own voice trembling, delivered a sermon not just of remembrance, but of warning. "Evil walks among us," he intoned. In the parking lot afterward, conversations twisted quickly from sorrow to talk of retribution, of whether the town could still trust its own institutions to protect the innocent. Meanwhile, the investigation into Mason's murder moved with desperation. Every officer juggled impossible pressure: solve the case quickly, but do not make mistakes. The evidence collection was painstaking. Dr. Lee's preliminary analysis of the ballistics, the neat, close-range shot wound and the trajectory, suggested execution. This was not a panicked crime of passion. It was the work of someone who'd planned every detail, someone who'd likely stalked Mason's movements in the days after his confession, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Detectives pored over Mason's last days. His phone logs, his handwritten notes, the witness protection plans in place, none revealed a clear warning. The police traced the muddy tire tracks to a particular kind of vehicle, an aging Ford pickup commonly seen in town but with a rare set of tires. Forensic teams compared the partial boot prints near Mason with those from the burned town hall. A faint but tangible link started forming. Tensions ratcheted higher with each passing hour. The Donaldson name circulated everywhere, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted. Yet as Chief Myers reminded his team, the case had to be built on proof, not rumors. They needed hard connections and, above all, a sense of how far the rot had spread through their once quiet town. For Dr. Lee, Mason's murder fostered a grim resolve. The fear and anger that was now Lakewood's daily currency galvanized her efforts. She barely slept, spending long hours bent over samples and paperwork in her makeshift lab. She surveyed security cam footage from shops and intersections, seeking flickers of Mason's shadowy tail or the elusive pickup truck. Each shred of forensic evidence, fiber, shoe print, shell casing, was a thread to be tugged, and she tugged it relentlessly. Amid this darkness, hope flickered. Mason's testimony, though posthumous, remained a powerful tool. His signed statement, his letter of fear and regret, and the physical evidence he had unwittingly helped lead them to, would form a bulwark against those intent on scaring the truth back into silence. Plans to reinforce witness protection were reassessed. Normal Lakewood life would not resume until the murderer was unmasked. The people wanted answers, and now, more than ever, the police had to deliver. A rushed search for clues within a limited time frame. The storm clouds that had hung low over Lakewood seemed to mirror the emotional weather of the town. With the murder of Mason Brooks, time was now the enemy. The investigative team understood that any further delay might mean that other witnesses, or even critical evidence, could slip away forever. It wasn't just the police working overtime. Everyone from Dr. Emma Lee to the newest patrol officer felt the crushing weight of urgency pressing upon them. The first sign that the killer had left more than just fear behind came in the form of tire tracks at the muddy edge of Willow Lake. The ground, still saturated from last night's rain, had preserved a near-perfect impression, a rare hexagonal tread, worn unevenly, with a patch where the rubber was nearly bald. Dr. Lee was the first to notice it as she directed the search by flashlight at dawn. Silently, she crouched down, photographing the track from multiple angles before cutting away a square of the muddy earth for the lab. Each subtle groove was precious, a potential lead that could pinpoint vehicles and, with luck, link them directly to a suspect. While officers cordoned off a wide perimeter around the crime scene, detectives started canvassing the roads near the lake. Every pickup truck, van, and off-road vehicle with mud on its tires was noted, and, if possible, discreetly photographed. Some drivers bristled at the attention, muttering about police overreach, but most cooperated, understanding what was at stake. Detective Williams, still haunted by Mason's shaken voice, knocked on doors and took down license plate numbers, assembling a list of every possible owner. Within hours, they narrowed the field to 4 likely candidates, each known to frequent the area. One of them, chillingly, was linked to the Donaldson clan. Back at the police station, Dr. Lee's makeshift laboratory was alive with energy. The evidence bags from that grim lakeside scene multiplied. A scrap of blue nylon snagged on a reed, several cigarette butts pressed deep into the soggy dirt, and a distinctive red gum wrapper tucked into the lining of Mason's jacket. Foreign, out of place, and perhaps dropped in the struggle. Each item was catalogued, labeled, and the DNA swabbing was prioritized. Though the process was painstaking, Dr. Lee felt a fire she hadn't felt in years, a personal investment in seeing justice for Mason, and for the battered soul of Lakewood. Amid the rush, a police helicopter whipped overhead, dropping off another forensics kit and a specialist brought in from the state capitol. The urgency was infectious, but so was the fear. Every officer found themselves glancing over their shoulders more than once, wondering if the killer was watching, waiting for a mistake. The Donaldson name, once merely a local menace, now became a specter haunting every aspect of the case. With the killer still on the loose, witness protection became even more critical and more complicated. Anyone with the smallest link to Mason was quietly advised to leave town for a while. Those who couldn't, bar owners, friends, even Mason's estranged sister, received regular check-ins and in some cases unmarked police surveillance. Lakewood, small and isolated as it was, now felt as vulnerable as glass. Meanwhile, Dr. Lee continued her methodical search for connections. The blue nylon proved to be a vital clue. It matched the material used in straps manufactured for a specific brand of duffel bag, one sold only at a hardware store on the outskirts of the next county. 2 officers were dispatched to examine sales records, security footage, and recent buyers. There, they struck gold. A man using cash had purchased 2 identical bags a week before the fire. His face wasn't entirely visible, but the posture, build, and partial tattoo captured in a reflection were enough for the locals to hazard a guess. Next came the gum wrapper, red with metallic trim and a logo for a regional brand favored by only a handful in town. With a combination of persistence and luck, the wrapper bore a partial fingerprint. Several officers worked through the department's old arrest records and fingerprint files, searching for a match. Each result was tested and retested, the digital comparison consuming hours as Dr. Lee hovered nearby. While the scientific side of the investigation leapt from one potential clue to the next, detectives dug deeper into the Donaldson family's connections. Cell phone records were subpoenaed, but the family had long learned to be cautious. Burner phones abounded among their circle, making tracking calls arduous. Even so, one call placed near Willow Lake late at night, from a disposable cell registered to a known Donaldson associate, hinted at coordination and premeditation. The townsfolk watched curiously and anxiously as more police and unfamiliar cars moved through the streets. Reports of the investigation's progress, or lack thereof, spread like wildfire in diners and on the radio. Some whispered that the police would never catch the real killer. Others said Dr. Lee was the best shot the town had ever had for real closure. Meanwhile, old alliances were tested, neighbors grew colder, and trust felt increasingly extinct. A sudden downpour one afternoon nearly wiped out the tire prints at Willow Lake, but Dr. Lee's earlier samples preserved evidence just in time. A fresh boot print was discovered beside the Jameson barn, a mile from the scene, where rumors said a Donaldson cousin was hiding out. This print, when laid against the tracks from the crime scene, revealed a matching set, one boot new, one worn. Detectives theorized the killer had changed boots after the killing, perhaps to confuse the investigation. From that point on, they tracked shoe sales, gathering receipts and checking recent footwear purchases at the local hardware and the only sporting goods store for counties. As evening settled and the investigation reached its fever pitch, a flurry of reports arrived. Ronald Donaldson, the youngest of the infamous brothers, had been seen driving a faded green pickup, the same type and tire as the one linked to the muddy tracks near the lake. Officers raced to pull security footage from service stations, piecing together Ronald's possible path by tracking time-stamped receipts. Each small mundane detail became critical. A soda bought at midnight, a gas fill-up paid in cash, and a chip bag left on the floorboard. All the while, a grim awareness hung over everyone involved. With Mason gone, this was perhaps their last, best shot at making an irrefutable connection to whoever had orchestrated such a carefully planned killing. Dr. Lee, never one for speeches, gathered the exhausted team late that night for a few brief words. "We're fighting the clock, but science and pressure are on our side. Let's bring Mason justice while there's still time." They redoubled their efforts, uniting small-town determination with cold forensic logic. The search extended late into the night, every hand on deck, as the storm that once threatened now promised to cleanse or erase whatever evidence was left. As the wind howled and rain battered the windows of the police station, one thing was unmistakable. Lakewood would never be the same, and neither would those charged with saving it from the shadows of its own making. The Donaldson family and the ghost of crime. The Donaldson family's name had echoed for decades in Lakewood, carried on bitter winds through drafty kitchen doorways and across the cracked booths in the back of Lee's diner. But after the destruction of Town Hall and the chilling murder of Mason Brooks, what was once local gossip had curdled into something far more insidious, a sense that the roots of violence ran deeper here than anyone cared to admit. There was no escaping the Donaldsons now. Their name was spoken in lowered voices and their reputation seemed to darken the town like an unseen storm cloud. Richard Donaldson was the eldest and, many whispered, the most dangerous of the lot. Even as a child he'd carried an air of menace, a quick temper, and the sort of calculating gaze that made people wary of turning their backs. Over the years Richard had accumulated a smattering of petty charges, a handful of local brawls, and a police record that read like a road map of poor decisions. Yet he always seemed to slither free from truly damning consequences, shielded by an odd mixture of street smarts, silence, and a knack for intimidation that kept both neighbors and potential witnesses in line. Ray, the brother who'd allegedly torched Town Hall, had always ridden the edge between anger and despair. Their youngest brother Ronald rarely factored into town troubles directly, instead skirting the law on the margins, whispered rumors of bootlegging, small-time dealing, stolen goods. Together, the Donaldson boys formed the sort of alliance that left law enforcement with a gnawing feeling in their guts, a family that circled the wagons, never aired dirty laundry, and never ever snitched. In a town where everyone's business was everyone else's, the Donaldson homestead on the eastern edge of Lakewood was a fortress of secrecy. A shingled house crouched on a rise behind crumbling stone walls, the property patrolled by restless dogs and in recent years a handful of night owl cousins who drifted in when times were hard. No matter the hour, there was always a light in a window and a warning presence on the porch. Lawmen treading up to the door for questioning rarely returned with more than bloody knuckles or veiled threats. "We don't have anything for you," Richard would sneer. "Why don't you go bother the real criminals?" When Mason Brooks was found dead, sodden and silent at Willow Lake's edge, suspicion flared. Mason, after all, had named Richard while shaking with terror in the police station. "If I wind up dead, it'll be Richard who did it." That kind of accusation, once uttered, bound the Donaldsons tighter together. Within hours of Mason's body turning up, the Donaldson property became a hive of anxious activity, cars coming and going at odd hours, voices raised in muffled arguments, and most unsettling, a sharp-eyed cousin posted by the mailbox, noting every car that slowed on the gravel road. Richard, unfazed in public, began moving with a subtle sharpness, never hurrying, but never caught unaware. He established an alibi, working the late shift at a scrapyard on the north side of town, but the stories didn't add up. Dr. Lee, still poring over evidence, discovered that a blue nylon fiber found at the lakeside scene matched a jacket often worn by Richard. Boot prints tracked in mud along the banks were compared against the custom soles of Richard's work boots. While the evidence remained circumstantial, the noose tightened. Ray became nervous, his once resentful bluster shifting into paranoid silence. The community, meanwhile, divided. Old-timers recalled a time when Richard had been the first to volunteer at the fire brigade, the first to dig out neighbors after a blizzard. Others remembered his swift, silent vengeance against perceived betrayals, the time a local mechanic's barn had burned hours after a dispute, or the days following a bar fight when an outspoken rival's truck was found trashed in the woods. The question no one would utter aloud: how many tragedies in Lakewood truly bore the Donaldson signature? Behind closed doors, police strategized their approach. They couldn't afford another witness to die, nor could they move on Richard with only lingering doubts and the frail shadow of Mason's last words. That left them seeking an inroad, some weakness in the Donaldson wall. Ronald, the youngest, seemed least committed to the family code. He drank too much, often arguing with Richard about money. Under scrutiny, Ronald began to waver. Days after a difficult police interview, he was seen borrowing cash in the grocery line, muttering that times change and people don't always stay loyal. Dr. Lee followed the leads methodically, matching glass fragments from the crime scene to a chipped beer bottle found behind the Donaldson garage, comparing cigarette butts to those collected at Willow Lake, lingering over every brittle trace. Still, Richard remained a cipher. Officers watched his routines, the way he deliberately swept the porch, the careful repositioning of a rusty pickup in the driveway, as if daring someone to check the treads. Interviews with family yielded little. Even under the threat of prosecution, aunts and cousins stonewalled, giving only clipped, rehearsed statements. "We don't know nothing. Just trying to live our lives." The specter of the Donaldson clan took on a mythic quality, an ever-present menace, shaping choices with little more than a look or a word. Shopkeepers exchanged glances and lowered their voices when Richard entered. Neighbors rescheduled errands to avoid the road past their property. Children whispered about the Donaldson curse, while their parents locked every window twice at night. The Donaldsons made a show of hosting summer barbecues but kept a strict guest list. Always family, never outsiders. Yet, beneath the surface, the once iron family solidarity started to crack. Ray's nerves got the better of him, and his drinking worsened. Ronald, caught between his brother's wrath and his own faltering conscience, spilled details to one of Dr. Lee's contacts. He admitted to providing Richard with the weapon that killed Mason. a 9mm pistol, the same caliber as the one found at the scene. The hardware store clerk confirmed that Ronald had bought unusual boots matching the rare pattern at Willow Lake, paid for in cash and never seen on his own feet. With each slip, the Donaldson web of protection weakened. Public tension in Lakewood grew into a palpable hum. Church sermons pleaded for calm, and a neighborhood watch began nightly circuits, reporting everything from suspicious headlights to stray cats. Rumors ran rampant. Some insisted Richard was about to run, others that the entire Donaldson clan would go down fighting if the law closed in. The town's quiet became haunted, punctuated not only by the memory of fire and murder but by the knowledge that the most dangerous threats often hid behind familiar faces and polite greetings. As the investigation accelerated, the legend of the Donaldsons became not just a story of villainy, but a case study in how crime festers in silence, thriving wherever fear outpaces truth. Their influence, part bluster, part real violence, demonstrated the darkness lurking beneath Lakewood's tranquil exterior. The family's downfall, though not yet complete, had become inevitable. Dr. Lee, the officers, and even the townsfolk could sense the fragile lines of loyalty fraying. It was only a matter of time before the weight of evidence and conscience finally brought the whole house down. Breakthrough from material traces. The search for truth in Lakewood had become a race against both time and memory, with every piece of evidence now holding monumental weight. After weeks of sifting through muddy trails, scattered artifacts, and whispered rumors, the true breakthrough emerged not from dramatic confessions or adrenaline-fueled chases, but from unassuming scraps of the physical world. Details that, at first glance, seemed benign but quickly became a mosaic of motive, method, and perpetrator. The first key in this unraveling narrative was the blue nylon thread. Dr. Emma Lee noticed it clinging stubbornly to a broken cattail, mere feet from where Mason Brooks's body had been found. She collected it with tweezers, mindful not to contaminate its telltale fibers. In the lab, this lonely strand was matched precisely to the binding on a duffel bag recovered from the Donaldson garage, a detail only a forensic scientist would spot, and one that placed someone from the notorious family at the literal scene of the crime. The duffel bag itself contained traces of soil consistent with the lakefront, and its zipper was scored in a peculiar way, matching faint marks on a set of bolt cutters recovered by the water's edge. Next came the gum wrapper. At first it was nothing more than litter, a red metallic label wedged into the lining of Mason's jacket. But a partial fingerprint deciphered from its shiny surface told another story. Using APHIS, Dr. Lee matched the print to Richard Donaldson, whose encounter with law enforcement over the years had left his biometric records in the system. The gum was a rare, regional brand, sold only at 2 local stores, one of which was captured by security cameras. Reviewing the grainy footage, deputies saw Richard purchasing a pack days before the murder, further threading the fabric of suspicion around him. Another vital find was the tiny light bulb, a mini-torch keychain, the kind a person might need on a moonless night near Willow Lake. It was left in the underbrush. The filament snapped as if someone had crushed it hurriedly underfoot. The model was traced via serial numbers to a hardware store just outside Lakewood. Store receipts pointed to a cash purchase days before the murder, and, most damning, the last bag sold on the shipment had been picked up by Ronald Donaldson, the youngest brother. Interviews revealed Ronald had lent the light to Richard, providing both a physical connection and an alibi that unraveled under the pressure of mounting proof. But perhaps the most decisive evidence came from the hexagonal boot print, a rare tread pattern found in the mud at both crime scenes. Dr. Lee meticulously cast the impression before it was washed away by rainstorms. At the Donaldson home, officers executed a search warrant and discovered a pair of mud-caked boots in the trunk of Richard's battered pickup. When the forensic team cleaned the soles, they found the matching hexagonal pattern, one boot slightly more worn than the other, just as observed at the lake, and beside the remnants of the burned town hall. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of the same lakeside clay embedded deep in the grooves, further tying Richard physically to Mason's murder. Alongside the physical evidence, the investigation was propelled forward by Ronald's shifting loyalties. Under the strain of police scrutiny, and perhaps a flicker of remorse, Ronald agreed to cooperate. He confessed to having sold a 9mm pistol to Richard weeks prior to Mason's death, with the weapon subsequently recovered and linked ballistically to the fatal shot at Willow Lake. Ronald's testimony, combined with the receipt from the hardware store and the timelines of his whereabouts, stitched together the narrative law enforcement so desperately needed. A conspiracy of silence was cracking from within. As each lead solidified, Dr. Lee worked hand in hand with detectives to cross-reference every item. Soil samples lifted from the duffel bag matched the mineral composition of the lakeshore. The flashlight fragment bore Richard's DNA on the battery casing. Surveillance footage pieced together Ronald's midnight purchase of boots and his nervous conversation with a clerk about needing something sturdy for muddy ground. Witnesses recalled seeing the Donaldson truck driving out toward the lake in the storm the night Mason died. In the midst of these revelations, police seized further items from the Donaldson property. A second duffel bag containing muddy towels, a broken watch with lake sediment under the case, and a set of work gloves that, when tested, revealed fiber transfers identical to fibers found on Mason's clothing. Each proof in isolation might have meant little. Together they dismantled the family's multi-layered wall of plausible deniability. The Donaldson brothers were placed in and around the scenes in a web so dense it could no longer be explained away by chance or conjecture. Richard's initial calm when confronted began to fray. Ray and Ronald, never as resolute as their older brother, wavered, especially as evidence chipped away at the lies they'd rehearsed. In the end, the physical world itself, mud, metal, fiber, and fingerprints, became the most reliable witness. For the people of Lakewood, this forensic web provided a certainty that testimony alone could never anchor, ensuring that even in a town mired in silence, the truth could be weighed, measured, and finally brought blazing into the light. Trial and the truth revealed. The trial of Richard Donaldson became the most anticipated, some would say dreaded, event in Lakewood's recent memory. The old courthouse, usually echoing with bureaucratic monotony, now thrummed with a nervous energy reminiscent of the night the town hall burned. Every pew was filled, townsfolk pressed in, anxious for a glimpse of the proceedings that would, at last, reveal the truth behind the fire and the chilling murder of Mason Brooks. The town's collective breath was held tight as defense attorneys, prosecutors, and jurors all took their places. Tensions simmered, not only within the courtroom's oak-paneled walls but throughout Lakewood. For many, the trial was more than a bid for justice. It was a reckoning, an opportunity to exorcise the shadow that the Donaldson family had cast over generations. Richard Donaldson stood at the defense table with the same cold composure he was notorious for, unflinching even as a battery of evidence mounted against him. It was a strange sight for those who remembered him as a boy sweeping the gutters, now flanked by high-powered lawyers from the city. Ray and Ronald, his brothers, stared forward with dead eyes, co-defendants whose fates now intertwined with his, their strained relationship evident in their rigid postures and clipped exchanges. The prosecution, helmed by Assistant District Attorney Karen Mills, opened with clarity and fervor. She did not waste time with dramatics but laid out, point by point, the physical evidence painstakingly gathered by Dr. Emma Lee and her forensic team. The blue nylon thread matched to the duffel bag in the Donaldson garage, the gum wrapper bearing Richard's fingerprint, soil samples consistent with the lakeshore, the rare sole boot prints, and the ballistic match to the fatal 9mm pistol. Mills hammered home the story of Mason Brooks, his reluctant, fearful confession, his desperate plea for protection, and finally, the tragic murder that ripped the heart from the prosecution's case. Carefully, Mills read passages from Mason's handwritten statement, the last words of a man who paid with his life for telling the truth. Audible gasps and tears punctuated the silence in the gallery. Mason's fate had become an open, festering wound for the entire town. The courtroom was heavy with grief, but also hungry for explanation. Mills used this to anchor her arguments, not just to prove Richard's guilt, but to restore a collective sense of order after months of chaos. She called Dr. Lee, who explained the methods and painstaking tests that had linked each piece of evidence to the Donaldsons. Charts appeared on screens cataloging threads, fibers, and treads. Even the battery DNA from the miniature flashlight made it in, further tightening the forensic noose around Richard's neck. Defense attorneys countered with skepticism at every turn. They challenged the integrity of the crime scene, suggesting evidence contamination. They hammered Mason's credibility, pointing out his history of anxiety and his odd request to appear bruised in custody. Yet even these attempts wilted beneath the professional weight of Dr. Lee and the relentless logic of physical proof. The Donaldson family's reputation for intimidation was a silent narrative beneath every line of questioning, the implication being that even the prosecution's witnesses were just as scared as Mason had been. Witness after witness took the stand, the barmaid who'd seen Ray last, neighbors who'd heard the Donaldson truck rumbling out in the night, the sales clerk who recognized Ronald's nervous voice, and small-town officers whose exhaustion was evident after months of sleepless nights. Each testimony underscored not just the facts, but the undercurrent of fear, how silence had nearly sunk the case before it ever began. For every wiggle room argument the defense offered, the prosecution answered with hard data, timelines, and forensic certainty. What sealed the turning point was the appearance of Ronald Donaldson on the witness stand. The youngest of the brothers, pale and gaunt, broke with a trembling voice. Directly questioned, with the judge's patience and Dr. Lee's science arrayed in stark support, Ronald admitted to providing Richard with the weapon, a detail already placed by circumstantial evidence. Pressed by Mills, he confirmed he'd seen Richard leave for Willow Lake the night Mason was killed, and that Ray, in raw desperation, had confided details that made clear he had set the fire under Richard's direction. The Donaldson alliance fractured publicly. Ray, weary and broken by the mounting evidence and the memory of the fire, finally spoke too. He recounted in a choked murmur how Richard had orchestrated the events from the shadows, fueling his brother's resentment, feeding paranoia, and ultimately, crossing every sacred line Lakewood's silent code had ever drawn. Suddenly the family's stolid image collapsed. Their history of silence became ammunition for the prosecution. In the gallery, old friends and enemies alike leaned forward. These revelations did not just unearth Richard's crimes, they forced Lakewood itself to reckon with the complicity of fear, the cost of looking the other way while a few men darkened the corners of everyone's lives. Attorney Mills took her closing argument deeper than legal logic. She urged the jurors to remember the values of their town, the responsibility everyone shared to protect the innocent. She spoke with trembling conviction of what happens when decent people are cowed by bullies. Lakewood must reclaim its peace, not by forgetting but by facing the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter who it implicates. For hours the jury deliberated, the weight of the town's suffering pressing in from all sides. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts for Richard, lesser but still damning sentences for Ray, the relief was palpable, but so was the grief. There would be no real celebration in Lakewood, only a somber release, a sense that the spell had broken and that healing could now begin in earnest. After the trial, a press conference was held on the courthouse steps. Dr. Lee, exhausted but resolute, offered only, "Science tells the truth, even when people are too scared to." Chief Myers promised the department would never again let intimidation threaten justice in their town. People lingered in knots along Main Street, processing the meaning of what they had witnessed, not just the unveiling of crime, but the difficult communal work of recovery. What made this trial unforgettable was not the spectacle or the headlines, but the sense, shared by everyone present, that Lakewood had come through its crucible. The trial laid bare not only the acts of the Donaldsons but the hidden fractures, grudges, and anxieties of the entire community. When the court adjourned and the doors finally closed, people poured out into the weak afternoon sunlight, changed in a way they never could have anticipated 6 months earlier. The gavel's final strike marked more than judgment. It announced the end of an era haunted by secrets and fear. For the first time in a generation, Lakewood could envision a future untethered from the darkness of its past. All it had taken was one witness, a trail of honest evidence, and the collective will to tell and accept the truth. Conclusion: Justice and lessons for a small town. In the months following Richard Donaldson's conviction, Lakewood wore its scars openly. The fire that had torn through its historic town hall became more than a tragic episode. It was a wound whose healing required more than just bricks and mortar. The trial's drama eventually faded from the nightly conversations, but the consequences lingered in every broken window and wary glance. For many residents, the return of order did not come swiftly. Even as Richard sat behind bars serving what amounted to a life sentence, and Ray began his years in a distant penitentiary, the collective heartbeat of Lakewood hesitated to settle. It wasn't just about losing a building or prosecuting a family. It was about confronting the darkness that had festered quietly for years, and now refusing to let it take root again. The new town hall, when it finally opened, was no grand monument. It was modest, built with practicality and caution. On its walls hung photographs salvaged from the ashes, old town meetings, faded 4th of July parades, black and white images of the lake frozen in long-ago winters. It stood as a symbol not only of Lakewood's resilience, but of its sobering recognition that institutions, like people, could only be as strong as the community that protected them. Old-timers gathered for coffee in the entryway, sharing stories about the bad times but also, in quiet voices, laughing about the neighborly feuds and small victories that marked life's return to something like normal. But the lessons ran deeper. Lakewood, once defined by its trust, sometimes naive, sometimes stubborn, found itself rebuilding a new kind of vigilance. If a family as deeply embedded as the Donaldsons could orchestrate such harm, whom could they trust? There was no longer a simple answer. People learned to look a little closer, to check in on each other, to notice when a friend stopped joining for church or a neighbor's car sat unmoved for days. Gossip, once the lifeblood of the town, evolved into something more conscious. A means of staying informed, yes, but also a form of collective watchfulness. The police, once criticized for their insularity and reluctance to seek outside help, rededicated themselves to transparency. Chief Myers, weathered by sleepless nights and relentless media scrutiny, led monthly community meetings, fielding questions that once would have been quietly dismissed. The hire of 2 new officers from outside the county symbolized a break from insular tradition, a signal that Lakewood was ready to accept change and that it had no intention of repeating the mistakes that allowed the Donaldsons' silent reign. The townspeople, too, found small ways to reclaim hope. Each spring after the trials, the local garden club planted daffodils and irises along Main Street, their blooms a quiet promise that beauty would outlast even the harshest winters. The library hosted reading nights featuring local writers who, without always naming the Donaldsons, crafted tales about courage, fear, and what it means to stand together when evil comes close. For the younger generation, the fire and killings became a cautionary legend, one retold around bonfires at summer camp or whispered during long, anxious walks home after dark. Teachers found themselves fielding difficult questions about justice, forgiveness, and what separates rumor from truth. For many youth, the shadow of that infamous night served as a stark lesson in the costs of silence and the importance of speaking out, even when every instinct says to hide. Not all wounds healed cleanly. Some families, particularly those related by blood or marriage to the Donaldsons, bore a lingering suspicion. They worried that any new problem would be met with old blame, that a broken window or petty crime might once again ignite whispers of past violence. Those closest to Mason Brooks, the witness murdered in pursuit of truth, carried their grief as an open ache. His name was engraved on a plaque outside the new courthouse, a quiet testament to personal sacrifice. Each year on the anniversary of the fire, bells tolled softly in the church steeple. Neighbors gathered for a candlelight vigil, recalling not only what they lost, but the unity they found in confronting it. Stories of Dr. Emily's determination, Chief Myers' steadfastness, and the citizens' refusal to look away from the town's darkest secrets became the new folklore. Reminders that the fight for justice continues long after the headlines fade. In the end, Lakewood emerged from tragedy not unscathed, but wiser. The process of rebuilding trust between neighbors, between officials and those they served, was messy and ongoing. Yet beneath the pain lay proof that communities are capable of extraordinary resilience, that even the most insidious shadows can be pierced by the steady work of decent people. No one could change the past, nor forget the price they paid for innocence lost. But through honesty, diligence, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, Lakewood found a way forward. In time, what was once a town defined by a night of terror became a place known for its quiet strength and an enduring belief that justice, however hard won, is worth pursuing and keeping at any cost.